Swinburne University of Technology.
Welcome everyone, nice to see a few fresh faces at our CAIA Research Seminar. Some people who haven't come here before, so thank you all for coming. Today's speaker is Philip Branch. Dr. Branch is a member of CAIA and the Telecommunications Group here at Swinburne University. He's held a number of roles. I first met Philip at Monash University when we both worked there quite some time ago. Philip worked as a software engineer in Tasmania and New South Wales before he realised that Victoria was a much better place to be, and he moved over here. He worked at Monash, he's worked for Ericsson where he's done some lawful interception research. Today he's going to be talking to us about metadata, which is particularly important considering the political arguments that are flying backwards and forwards more recently over the concept of metadata. So I won't talk for much longer. Instead, I'll hand over to Philip so he can continue with the presentation.
Well, thank you, Jason. I have to say I feel a bit jumpy talking in front of such a diverse and august audience, so let's get into it. I'm going to talk about metadata in the context of which it's been talked about lately. It's come out of lawful interception. There are different meanings for metadata, but the meaning in terms of the legislation that's being proposed, in terms of all this discussion, is to do with lawful interception. That's where it's come from. So I'll talk a bit about lawful interception before I get on to metadata retention. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so we have to be guided by the politicians and bureaucrats as to what the legislation actually means. And there does seem to be some diversity of opinion, but we'll see where it actually leads us. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what this legislation apparently means for ISPs, for internet service providers. What do they have to retain? What they have to do? And then I'll wrap it up with, I think, a few quotes from other people who sort of capture the whole thing. Who better to answer the question, what is metadata, than George Brandis? Let's have a look. He obviously has limited understanding, and yeah, it's easy to make fun of people from this area. It's pretty obvious there's quite a lot of confusion, even amongst the people who have been proposing this legislation as to just what it actually means. My feeling is that there is some merit to some metadata retention, but the way it's being presented, the way it's being discussed, has certainly left quite a lot to be desired. In fact, the metadata retention proposals came from the law enforcement agencies because they were concerned about the effectiveness of lawful interception. So they wanted to make sure that they could still wiretap, still communicate, still capture communications as effectively in the new internet environment as they were able to do in the telephony environment. So that's where it's come from. These are quite old proposals. What has made it very difficult is that they were not in the least bit specific about what data was to be collected. In fact, the data that was to be collected was originally going to be specified by regulation. And metadata, if you don't say what it is, it could mean so many different things, so much that it could cover. So obviously got everyone a little bit concerned. Ultimately, the actual data to be collected, to be retained, it was written into the legislation in order to get it passed. Anyway, we'll talk about that. So what is metadata? Let's see if we can do better than George. Metadata is usually defined as information about information, as opposed to the call content. Now, the term came out of telephony, at least in this context, where the distinction is quite apparent. Okay? In a telephone call, the call content is the actual voice conversation, and metadata is all the information associated with it. So the number's called, the duration of the call, name and address of the subscriber associated with that number. Okay, so this is fairly static, and this will happen as people make calls. It's worth pointing out that most intercepts are just of metadata. They're not the content. They're just this sort of information here. And the main reason for that is that the main thing that the law enforcement agencies want is what's called network analysis. They want to know who is talking to whom, what relationships are out there. the actual content is much less important. Okay. Now, metadata is reasonably clear when you're talking about telephony, but much less so when you're talking about internet-based services. It really starts to become much less clear as to what exactly is metadata. Now, there's quite a lot of blurring. Is the name of a file you download, is that metadata? I don't know, probably. Is the subject line of an email metadata? Maybe, maybe not. Is your location metadata? Probably. But what about if you're using Gmail, using Google Maps, and the application makes use of that location? Then it's an inherent part of the content. So in the modern environment, metadata really starts to mean a lot less than it used to. And there's been some advocacy for getting rid of the term altogether. Malcolm Turnbull has said, can we outlaw the term metadata? Okay. He hasn't actually done much about it, but he's actually said it. And the idea is that you really need to look at individual items of data and their relative sensitivity. That would make a lot more sense than this broad category of content and metadata. Metadata in the past, very easy to get a warrant for. Very easy to intercept it. Lots of organisations can do it. You don't need a judge or a magistrate to sign it off. You just be an authorised representative of a particular organisation. There's quite a few, and you can collect metadata. Yeah. And that's really one extreme. The other extreme is the content. You do need all that sort of judicial oversight. So it would make a lot more sense to have a bit more of a gradation rather than this either or. Now, this legislation came out of lawful interception. In particular, came out of their concern that the effectiveness of lawful interception was being undermined by internet-based technologies. Okay, lawful interception, phone tapping, wiretapping. In most Western countries, it's very tightly controlled, lots of judicial oversight. Some other countries perhaps less so. But it is a very powerful tool, very widely used tool for law enforcement. They regard it very strongly. This is where the problem came from. Interception at the IP layer is based on IP addresses. I mean, that's the only thing that you have that can be linked back to identity. But we have protocols like DHCP which allocate IP addresses as they're needed. There can be no guarantee just looking at a stream of packets as to who that person, as to who the owner of that stream of packets is. Also, billing is changing as well. In the past, it was necessary to keep these records of who called whom, because that was how you were billed. Now, seeing new business models come along where billing is based is not based on the volume of traffic. So there's perhaps no need to keep these call records. So you cannot trace who's talking to whom, and you lose that network analysis capability. Okay, so certainly the law enforcement agencies were quite concerned about that. Well, I think I've mentioned this. Came out of fixed line telephony interception, called intercept-related information in that context, and there was that very, very clear distinction between call content and information about the call, the metadata. And with fixed line, back in the old days, it was very simple. There wasn't that much information to collect. The numbers called, or that were calling you, the duration of the call. More advanced systems, you started to get a little bit more, but still, the division was pretty clear. So you had call diversion. Mobile telephony, still more metadata. But again, the distinction was still reasonably clear. So let's have a look at how some of these things work, just to make it clear how interception has been done. This is a fixed line interception. Okay, you've got the law enforcement agency. They issue a warrant. If it's for the content, then it's a warrant that has to be signed off by a judicial officer. If it's for metadata only, it doesn't. This goes to the telco or the ISP, and they have some administration function. which then propagates the warrant out to the relevant switch. In the case of fixed line communication, there's just the one switch, the one that your house is connected to. Then when you make a call to the switch, the call goes through the caller, but the call content also goes off to the law enforcement agency, if it is a warrant for call content. And signalling information that was used to set up the call goes to a mediation function and is then formatted as intercept-related information. Okay? Mobile interception, a little bit more complicated. The only real difference is that instead of just having one point, there's multiple points. You have these mobile switching centres. And depending on where you are in the network, you'll be attached to a different mobile switching centre. Essentially the same sort of thing. There have been some amazing scandals. There's some of this information in a German case where this call information to the law enforcement agency made its way into the billing system, and the customer was billed for these calls here, which is a bit embarrassing. With mobile interception, there's also a richer set of metadata. Call forwarding, location based on the cell tower. So there's a bit more that you can do with mobile interception. And again, you have this same sort of thing here. If there was no, if this was just a metadata-only intercept, then you would not have this one here going off to the law enforcement. You just have this one here going. GPRS. This was the first case where it became necessary for telcos to start carrying out internet interception. Excuse me. And again, it was much the same sort of model as for mobility. This time, though, you had these things here, SGSNs. I can't remember what that stands for, server gateway, serving node, something like that. So they occupied much the same sort of role as the MSCs did in a GSM network. And you had much the same sort of thing happening. Now you have to imagine that there's also the MSCs sitting here as well, which I haven't included on the diagram. You see it's starting to get a bit cluttered. But still much the same sort of an architecture, right, except that this time it's packets we're dealing with rather than call content. In the mediation process, you can certainly see the hangover from the telco environment. The packets were streamed by UDP to the LAA rather than, say, put into chunks and sent off as files or something like that. So you still had very much the same sort of model was used even in this particular internet-based technology. All right, so it started to become apparent that this model was not really sustainable. People tried for a while. So there are standards for interception of 3G, ADSL, cable modem, etc., etc., etc. But there's problems with that. Okay, you can see you're starting to get lots of technologies, lots of equipment needed to actually do the interception down at this particular level. It made a lot more sense to start looking at higher layers to do interception, in particular to the application layer and the IP layer. Just a few names, there's a whole lot of standards for this. Most of these layer 2 services have been aggregated into one standard, but for some time there was quite a few. Okay, so internet lawful interception. Let's look at how that progressed. So we're talking about intercepting the next layer up now. We're talking about intercepting at the IP layer, intercepting at a router typically. In the early days of the internet, ISPs were small, limited capabilities, limited interception capabilities as well. Sometimes the ISP operator was the person under investigation. It could be quite embarrassing. You can't really ask them to put a warrant on you. So generally, in those early days of IP-based interception, it was somewhat ad hoc. The law enforcement agency would wheel in something. They would just grab all the packets and look at them at their leisure. Carnival is perhaps the most famous example of that. Probably not the best way to go about it. We can see all sorts of conflicts of interest, all sorts of opportunities for corruption, but it has to be said that back in, 15 years or so ago, there wasn't a lot of choice, and really there wasn't a lot of demand for it at that time, certainly by the police, by the law enforcement agencies for IP interception. But it was obvious it was going to come along. Cisco did quite a lot of work on how you could do interception with their equipment. This is an RFC. It's written by Fred Baker. He sometimes visits here. He sort of led that particular area. And you can see it's still much the same sort of architecture, except in this case you get some sort of mediation, some sort of reformatting of the actual packets as they go off to the LAA. It doesn't go directly. And that might be to, say, put them into files or do some sort of processing before they send them. Okay, so that was, that's how it's evolved. And there's other motivations as well for taking this particular approach. You started to get lots of, you start to see VoIP service providers, okay, people who provided a VoIP service only. Also have telcos, the telco technologies. You have this rationalisation for an all IP core. So regardless of the underlying technology, you're using IP. Okay, so it made sense to move to interception at the IP layer. But intercepting at the IP layer presents new problems. Alright, so if you're intercepting in the router, the only identifier you've got is the IP address. IP addresses are not necessarily static. They're not allocated to you permanently. Most of the time, they're not. They're usually allocated via some protocol like DHCP. So that you need to have, so that if you're looking at, if you're doing interception, you're looking at IP packets and you see an IP address and it came from someone, that IP address might be used by someone different last week, it might be used by someone different next week. Right. So it meant that LEAs needed ISPs to retain that information for sufficient time so that they could see who had that IP address at that time. And that leads us to metadata retention. Should be trumpet sounding or something. This is where it's all come from. This was the driver. That was the driver of it. David Irvine, former director of ASIO, was the person who pushed this, proposed this. And he frequently, when he said, look, all we want is an internet telephone book. Okay? He wanted the same capabilities. He wanted to be able to look at some communication, be able to link it back to identity, in the same way as he could with telephony. He wanted to be able to do that with the internet. I was telling that he spoke in these sorts of terms, telephone book. I mean, that certainly does suggest a certain worldview. But that's what they wanted. That was the driving point. And also there was some of the other things I've mentioned. New business models of IP-based service operators, no individual call charges, some sort of flat rate. And that meant no records for individual calls. And that meant that network analysis, in the sense of looking at people of interest, suspects, who they're communicating with, that perhaps might have disappeared. Not surprisingly, because the actual metadata to be collected was not specified, there was, perhaps still is, a great deal of concern from the ISPs, notably IONET. They took the lead on this. They estimated collecting all metadata would cost $130 per customer per year, would generate 1 petabyte of data per day, which is lots, would need a new data centre dedicated just to metadata per month. And this is a fairly famous, here's a tweet, and who used all the metadata? And it's pretty scary when you look at it and see all the stuff that's there. I didn't realise that location information was in there as well. So anyway, if all metadata was to be collected, and there was nothing to say that it wasn't going to be collected, there was quite a lot of reason for concern. But eventually, very late in the process, after some leaks rather than official releases, the actual data to be collected was released. Originally it was going to just by regulation, which meant it could be changed fairly easily by the Attorney General's Department, but it's now written into the legislation what the actual data is. And at first glance it looks pretty alarming. Okay? So you've got account information, subscriber information, what you do, what your services are that you're subscribed to. The source of the communication, the destination of communication, date, time, duration, the type of communication, location of equipment. There's probably not much else there, is there really? You look at that. What else could they ask for? However, sadly, fortunately, not as simple as that list suggests. You do need to have a look at the legislation to make sense of it, and I'm not a lawyer, but let's have a look. There are two provisions that limit that above list. So here's the first one. Now, the actual provision itself is a lot of legalese that I find hard to read, but there are these explanatory notes. This paragraph puts beyond doubt that service providers are not required to keep information about subscribers' web browsing history. And that includes the destination IP address that you're communicating with. And that, the way that legislation is written, it seems to exclude any sort of communication. Right, so Skype, for instance, seems to be excluded. Maybe. Then the next one says, this paragraph puts beyond doubt that service providers are not required to keep information or documents about communications that pass over the top. Right, that means that, using Skype again as an example, an ISP is not required to keep signalling information specific to Skype. And they need to keep information about the lower layers, but they're not obliged to try and interpret up the protocol stack. Okay, so that's a bit of a relief. But then there's this. It says, to avoid doubt, if information that subsection 1 requires a service provider to keep in relation to communication is not required by the operation of a relevant service, subsection 1 requires the service provider to use other means to create the information or document containing the information. I have no idea what that means.
It sounds like I might make it up.
Does that contradict the previous quest section? Perhaps we need a QC to explain it to us. Maybe not. Oh, what happened there? Oh, where'd they go? Maybe there is someone with a law and technology background who can explain it. Oh, yes, there is. In fact, Malcolm's been saying lots of really interesting things. And if you listen to Malcolm, then as far as he's concerned, all this stuff involves is keeping a record of that linkage between IP address and identity. There's a very, really interesting interview with him about this on ABC Hour and Drive if you want to look for it. I couldn't find a transcript, unfortunately, but it's well worth listening to. So he sort of goes on for quite some time about how it's just about IP address and linking it to identity. But then there was someone texting a question, are you going to keep email headers? And he had to concede that yes, you do. You do wonder what else he might have had to concede if people would send them. But as far as he's concerned, those are the two main things that that are to be retained. Information about linkage of IP address to an account and email header information, which comes under messaging. But he gave the very useful advice that if you use Gmail instead, you can avoid it. In fact, he's been giving lots of advice on how to avoid the legislation. Malcolm Turnbull's Sky News interview basically renders the metadata retention laws useless. So anyway, there was another interesting interview from Malcolm. Basically, his advice is to use, to people who want to avoid using, having their metadata caught up, is to use over-the-top applications that are not based in Australia. Okay, so there's no obligation on ISPs to collect information, metadata specific to that application. And if the application is not located in Australia, well, metadata won't be collected. And Mr. Turnbull gives us a nice list of suggested applications for voice, Skype, or Viber.
Is it keep secret they're trying to encourage us to go there so that they can monitor it?
I don't know. Well, I'll get to that in a minute, actually, because I think.
Isn't there also a caveat here that this is what they're saying this is going to be avoided now? They'll
I'll get to that in a minute.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's a good point. Good points, but I'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, so he recommends these applications for messaging, WhatsApp, Wicker, and so on and so on. Email, use an email account not associated with an Australian carrier such as Gmail. There's a gazillion of them. All right. Now, I have to say I'm not sure his advice is entirely sound, particularly with peer-to-peer applications like Skype. The Skype server's set up, the signalling goes on probably outside of Australia, but ultimately it results in direct transfer of data between sender and receiver. It's a peer-to-peer application. Now, if the recipient is a high-profile activist or journalist, and you want to get in touch with them because there's something going on that you know about and you think they should know about, there's a risk that they may have a metadata-only warrant against them. Metadata warrants are very easy to get. Just has to, there's not the same sort of judicial requirements as for other types of metadata, as for other types of intercepts. And the data collected from that will show communication between you and their IP address. And data retention will then allow your identity to be obtained. So I'm not sure it's good advice to use Skype. I'm also not sure about Gmail. If you send something to an email server that's located in Australia, then my understanding is that that email address will show up. But you know, the other advice seems pretty sound, particularly Wickr. I started using Wickr. That's very impressive. Okay, so what's actually left? Malcolm Turnbull's believe there's not much really. All ISPs need to do is keep account data, keep DHCP records, keep email headers if they operate a mail server for the customers. This is perhaps one that's a little bit strange. Keep records of upload and download volume for her customer. It has led people to suspect that maybe that's for policing copyright violations, and it's hard to understand what other possible purpose that could be. But these are the ones that, again, if this is what Malcolm Turnbull interpretation is correct, you do not need to collect the destination IP addresses, and you do not need to collect data that's specific to over-the-top services. Now there is still some confusion. Talk about the costs first. Prime Minister Abbott said it would cost about $300 million. Attorney General Brandis says $4 per customer per year. There's a bit of difference between those two. And telcos are now saying the costs are manageable. But there's still concerns. There's still quite a lot of concerns. The legislation gives considerable latitude, that's the point you're making, to the Attorney General to specify what is or what can be included. Okay, all he has to do is declare it by regulation and then have it ratified within 40 sitting days of Parliament. Legislation is complicated. We non-lawyers are reliant on interpretations from people who are intimate, who have a good understanding of the legislation as to what it actually means. And that could get messy if you have different interpretations from different people. Email headers are included. I think that's quite worrying. And then you have this question, why? Why do they want the volumes of traffic, upload and download? Anyway, that's basically it. The law enforcement agencies who kicked this off, their main motivation was to ensure they had the same data available to them in the emerging, in the modern communications environment as they'd always had, or as they'd had for decades. Now, you do suspect maybe there's a bit of overreach, messaging, and the volume requirements, but the initial goal was quite modest. They wanted what they thought of as an internet telephone book. But legislation has got quite complex. But it is significant that some ISPs are now saying it's quite manageable. But I am inclined to agree with these statements. This whole thing is maximum pain for minimum gain, and it might catch the stupid ones. All right, that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Phil.
It's a pleasure.
Anyone got any questions for Phil? Whoa, we'll start down the front, then we'll go up to the one back.
So, since they've cut out like a lot of the identifying of what they're communicating with, what is, I understand the metadata for the telephony is there in the thing. What about the IP metadata? Because all they're recording now is just the source IP address and that's it.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, so what's really the point?
Yeah. Yeah, what is the point?
Yeah.
And that's a good question. I mean, if it's as easy to subvert as Mr. Turnbull has suggested, you do wonder what the point of the whole exercise has been. So is it that simple? Is there another interpretation we're going to see?
Maybe they've got it all through already.
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
Graham?
You alluded to metadata being really easy to obtain. I recall reading random blog posts suggesting RSPCA can request metadata. Who can do it? How do you become that person?
Yeah, that's perhaps the most famous example of. It's first of all, it's much easier to get a metadata only intercept than one that includes content. You don't have to get it approved by a magistrate. But yeah, the range of organisations that could request it is quite extraordinary. RSPCA is perhaps the one that sort of leaps out at people. That has been tightened up in the legislation, so there's fewer organisations now that can request metadata. There's still quite a few, and those organisations, the way they can be extended by the Attorney General by regulation. So we could put in an application to the AG, I guess, if we wanted to.
It's sort of the hidden weakness, isn't it? A bit like certificate authorities in your browsers. Nobody realises quite how many people are trusted by your browser.
Exactly.
Any other questions?
Okay, well, that was easy.
There's an interpretation about what's the use of just simply recording source address, the mapping of source addresses to customers. One interpretation could be that in fact ASIO have taps on everything major fibre in Australia anyway, so all they have to do is cross-reference. They've already got the traffic. They just need a legal way of mapping the IP addresses, so they go to the ISPs and say, who's this IP address? Because we already know they've been talking.
Yeah. It depends how paranoid you get. But we know certainly. I mean, we don't necessarily know that, but we know that the NSA do pretty much that for any traffic. I mean, if there's something really serious, they really wanted to find you. There is the Five Eyes agreement. There's agreements between the different intelligence agencies. It's hard to hide.
We're seeing this for telcos that we see at the first level where they're providing to the customers. I mean, the government could have agreements with the higher up telcos say, give us more data. And that may not be public knowledge as well.
Could be.
Yeah, cross-referencing.
It's cross-referencing. I mean, there's a lot of if you can see, if you can limit, if you're a law enforcement agency, you're trying to find where a leak has come from, and you can limit it to a certain number of people, then you don't need a lot of additional information to pinpoint exactly who that person might be who's been doing the leaking. So, yeah. It's not just this sort of information that's used. There's other information as well that's used in concert with this that can be used for intelligence gathering.
So would encryption be considered an over-the-top service?
Yeah.
DPS, for example.
Yeah. There's. I tried to read the legislation and my eyes glaze over, but I don't remember there being a reference to having to hand over encryption keys or the like. So I imagine it would be seen as an over-the-top application. Yeah.
As far as my interpretation in terms of cryptography in Australia, you're required to keep any part that you must encrypt, you must keep it secure, so transmission of key would be breaching that legislation.
Okay.
There was an article about somebody was trying to host stuff. Australian data in America, and America requires them to be able to access it at any time.
Okay.
So there was a conflict of legislation.
Yeah. Yes, it's a messy area. Yeah.
I read some stuff about how in, I think it's Germany and also I think they're looking into it in the US of stopping metadata retention because it hasn't been useful. Is the way that we're implementing it any different to how it was implemented there to justify ignoring that evidence?
I'm getting out of my depth with that. I'm not. I don't really know whether it was that different, but I am aware that it hasn't proven to be much use elsewhere where it has been deployed. I'm not sure if it's that different to what we want here. I imagine it would be similar in that the same sorts of issues have cropped up. I mean, moving from lower layer to IP layer interception, you'd have the same sorts of issues regardless of where you were. But I'm not aware of the details.
So I used to work in Ericsson, and now the mobile connect work using the mobile service solution. And most of the call now is VoIP and through the backbone, and they still have the lawful interception. So is it against the law that you're talking about it? Because once they intercept the VoIP voice call, they need to have the destination address and so is it against?
I don't think it's not against the law. It's more, can they do it? It's more, how do you map those? I mean, that's the whole point of my understanding. The whole point of this legislation, this exercise, is to be able to make that mapping from those IP addresses to identity. You know, the telcos have moved to an all IP core for voice, but also for everything else. So, so that's sort of driven the problem. So yeah. And I used to work for Ericsson too. So yeah.
We're also chasing our tails. I mean, we're moving the data retention and analysis up to the IP layer, but there's big pushes now to do security, SSL or HTTPS everywhere. And if that happens, well, what's the point? Well, metadata is still metadata, and that's probably valid. But if you go to the content capturing, well, how will that be?
Yeah,
that does become prevalent as the main means of communication.
Yes, you do wonder how viable content collection is going to be over the next few years or decades. But you know, the point is that most interceptions are about establishing relationships. Most of them are about just collecting metadata necessary to construct those relationships. Network analysis, they call it.
I suppose at the end of the day, when you think about it, if they're going to the ISP and going, hey, we want the information about this person, they've already tapped them anyway. They would have already known what's going. They have some sort of idea that it's going to be extra correlation with data.
They want to be able to fill in that final point. Okay, so there's an intercept on this person here. Someone talks to them. They want to be able to work out who that person is, and this metadata retention enables them to do that.
It's interesting too, because you've got a solution on one hand in terms of establishing sort of point-to-point contact or whatever, and then on the other hand, if you're actually if the amount of content that you're retaining is increasing so dramatically, then you've got security issues and everything on that side. So it's sort of, you know, you do that and then you create a problem over here.
Yeah, that was one of the things that IONET emphasised very strongly. If you've got huge stores of wide-ranging metadata, then that's a very attractive target for hackers, crackers. So you have to have very good security on that metadata if it's sensitive metadata. Yeah.
So, just one last question for you. When any communication thing, there's got to be there'll be two source addresses because you have somebody connecting to another person. How do you figure out that person's actually communicated with them based on this metadata?
Say again, sorry.
So for example, if I communicate to you and you've got a warrant on you for metadata, they only get your source address, they don't get my source address. So how do they actually...
No, if there's a warrant on me, they get everything other than the content.
I meant just a metadata warrant.
Yeah, if it's a metadata warrant, they get everything other than the content. And the metadata will include the IP addresses of people who talk to me as well as my IP address. So it enables that. I mean, the actual metadata for all of us, if Mr. Turner wants to believe, does not include who we talk to. But if there's a warrant on us, then that's quite a different scenario, much more intrusive. Sorry, say again?
Just based on the collection of metadata in that warrant then, so they wouldn't know based on that metadata.
That's my understanding, yeah.
Okay. Any final questions before we wrap up the seminar for today? Thanks again, Phil.
Pleasure.
Thank you to everyone for coming.
This has been a Swinburne production.